There were conversations about their plans to meet up, about how they missed each other, and intimate details that I couldn't bear to read. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, but instead, I just stood there, gripping it tightly as if holding onto it would somehow give me control over the situation. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my mind swirling with a mix of emotions. Anger, hurt, disbelief, and confusion. How could this have happened? How could David, the man I had trusted with my heart, betray me like this? I had been thousands of miles away, fighting for our country, fighting for us, and this is what he had been doing? My thoughts raced, trying to piece together the moments that had led to this. Had he been lonely? Was it because I had been gone so long? But then I stopped myself. No. This wasn't about me. This was about his choices, his betrayal. I had been loyal. I had given everything to this marriage, even when it meant sacrificing my own needs and desires for the greater good of our relationship. And this was how he repaid me. For a moment, I thought about confronting him right then and there. I imagined storming into the bathroom, holding up his phone, and demanding answers. But instead, I sat there, paralyzed by the weight of what I had just discovered. I needed time to process. I needed to think about what this meant for our future, for my future. As I sat there, my mind raced through a million possibilities. What if he lied to me again? What if he tried to cover it up? Would I ever be able to trust him again? And if I couldn't trust him, could we even stay married? The tears started to flow before I could stop them. I had always thought of myself as a strong woman. After all, I had survived deployments, war zones, and the hardships that came with being in the military. But this was a different kind of battle. This was a fight for my heart, my marriage, and my sense of self-worth. And I wasn't sure I had the strength to win it. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of everything. I thought about the woman in the messages. Who was she? Was she someone David had met while I was away? Had they been together for long? I wondered if she knew about me, if she knew that David was married, or if he had kept that part of his life hidden from her. The questions were endless, but the answers didn't matter, not in that moment. What mattered was that my husband, the man I had loved and trusted for so many years, had betrayed me. And now, I had to decide what to do next. I put the phone down and wiped my tears, taking a deep breath. This was a crossroads, a moment that would define the rest of my life. I knew that confronting David was inevitable, but I also knew that I needed to gather my strength before I did. I needed to be clear-headed and prepared for whatever excuses or lies he might try to offer. So, instead of confronting him right away, I made a decision. I would wait. I would wait until I was ready, until I had processed everything and could face him with the calmness and clarity I needed. And when that moment came, I would demand the truth, no matter how painful it was. The next morning felt like the calm before the storm. I had barely slept the night before, my mind swirling with every possible scenario of how this confrontation would go. As the sun crept through the blinds, I could feel the weight of the decision I had made settling into my chest. I knew today would change everything. I could no longer sit in silence, pretending everything was okay. It was time for David to face the truth, and for me to hear it straight from him. David had already left for work by the time I got out of bed. I found myself wandering through our house, each room holding memories of the life we had built together. I paused at our wedding photo hanging in the hallway, remembering the day I had promised to stand by his side through thick and thin. I had kept my promises, even when it meant being apart for months on end, even when it meant putting my career and life on the line. But David, he had broken his. He had shattered the very foundation of our marriage with his lies. I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed my phone and texted him, telling him we needed to talk as soon as he got home. My stomach twisted as I hit send, knowing that there was no turning back now. Today, the truth would come out, whether I was ready for it or not. The day dragged on like never before. Every second felt like an hour, and I found myself pacing the living room, replaying his betrayal over and over again in my head. How could he do this to me? To us? My thoughts raced through all the possible excuses he might try to give. Would he admit to the affair? Would he try to downplay it, say it was just a mistake or a moment of weakness? Or worse, would he lie and try to cover it up, even though I had seen the evidence with my own eyes? By the time David walked through the door that evening, I was ready. My heart pounded in my chest, but I had made a decision. No matter what he said, I would keep my composure. I wouldn't let him turn this around on me, make me feel like I was overreacting or being irrational. I would demand the truth, and I wouldn't settle for anything less. He walked into the living room, looking tired and distracted, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. I stood there, arms crossed, waiting for him to sit down. He must have sensed something was wrong because his expression changed. He looked at me with concern, but I could see the flicker of guilt in his eyes. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion bubbling up inside me. David nodded and sat down on the couch, running his hand through his hair. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, bracing myself for what was about to come. "I know about the affair, David. I know about her." His face paled instantly. The color drained from his cheeks as if the life had been sucked out of him. For a brief moment, he didn't say anything, just stared at me, his mouth slightly open as if searching for the right words. But there were no right words. There was no explanation that could undo the hurt he had caused. He started, but I cut him off. Don't try to deny it. I saw the messages on your phone. I know this has been going on for almost a year." The room fell silent. David lowered his head, unable to meet my eyes. I could see the shame written all over his face, but it didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made the betrayal even worse. He wasn't going to fight it. He wasn't going to try to explain it away. I fought for my country, only to come home to my husband's heartbreaking betrayal. There are few things more exhilarating than the feeling of coming home after a long time away, especially when that time has been spent in a war zone. The moment I stepped off the plane, I was overwhelmed by a mixture of relief and anticipation. The smells, the sights, the air itself, everything about being back in the United States felt like a dream after spending over a year deployed in Iraq. I couldn't wait to see my husband, David Andrews, again. It had been months since we'd last seen each other, and I clung to the hope that our reunion would feel like coming home, not just physically, but emotionally. I'd served my country with pride for nearly 2 decades, but those months in Iraq had been some of the toughest I'd ever endured. The strain of being away from my loved ones, combined with the pressures of leadership and combat, had taken its toll. I was tired of the endless conflict, tired of always being on high alert, and tired of missing my family. The one thing that kept me going was the thought of David, the man I had shared 15 years of my life with, waiting for me at home. Or at least, that's what I believed. When I finally arrived home, it didn't feel like the joyful homecoming I had imagined. There were no balloons, no warm embraces, and no sense of relief. Instead, when I opened the door, David was sitting on the couch, staring at the television. He glanced up when I walked in, gave me a small smile, and then went back to whatever show he was watching. I stood there in the entryway, still in my uniform, holding my bags, waiting for the flood of emotion to come from him, the tears, the hugs, the excitement of being reunited. But none of that happened. I told myself that maybe he was just caught off guard, that the reality of my return hadn't sunk in yet. Maybe he needed time to process the fact that I was home. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that something was wrong. David wasn't himself. He was distant, almost cold, and no matter how hard I tried to reconnect with him, there was always a wall between us. The man I had loved for so many years, the man I had shared my hopes, dreams, and fears with, was no longer the same. It was as if he had become a stranger in our own home. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just the adjustment period. After all, I had been gone for a long time, and deployments take a toll on everyone. Maybe David had been dealing with his own struggles while I was away. But as the weeks passed, the little things started to add up. He would leave the house late at night for meetings with friends, but never tell me who he was meeting. His phone would ring at odd hours, and he would take the calls in another room, speaking in hushed tones. There were even nights when he wouldn't come home at all, offering vague excuses the next day. It wasn't just the distance between us that bothered me, it was the feeling that he was hiding something. The more I tried to reach out to him, the more he pulled away. He was always distracted, always preoccupied with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. When I asked him about it, he would brush me off, saying that everything was fine and that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know what. One evening, after another one of his late-night disappearances, I sat alone in our bedroom, trying to make sense of the situation. I had sacrificed so much for our marriage, for our future. I had missed birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, precious moments that I could never get back, because I was serving my country. And yet, here I was, feeling more alone than I had ever felt during my deployment. The following morning, I confronted David again, hoping for some sort of explanation. I asked him why he had been so distant, why he seemed to have one foot out the door. But once again, he dismissed my concerns, telling me that I was just being paranoid and that everything was fine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying. I could see it in his eyes, in the way he avoided looking at me when I asked him direct questions. There was something he wasn't telling me, and I was determined to find out what it was. I decided to give him space, hoping that things would eventually go back to normal, but instead, the distance between us only grew. I'd always prided myself on being strong, both physically and mentally, but this was a different kind of battle. This was a fight for my marriage, a fight to understand why the man I loved had become someone I no longer recognized. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. While David was in the shower, I picked up his phone, which he had left on the kitchen counter. I didn't want to snoop, but I felt like I had no other choice. My heart raced as I unlocked his phone and started scrolling through his messages. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just a few conversations with friends and family. But then, I saw it. A name I didn't recognize. A string of texts that made my blood run cold. The messages were clear, intimate, and painful. My husband was having an affair. And it had been going on for nearly a year, almost the entire time I had been deployed in Iraq. I stood there in shock, staring at the screen. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands shook as I scrolled through the messages. Each word felt like a dagger, cutting deeper and deeper into my heart. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. David had been texting another woman, someone I had never even heard of, and from the tone of their conversation, it was clear that they weren't just friends. There were messages about meeting up, about how much they missed each other. Some were about nights they'd spent together. My mind went blank, and for a moment, I just stood there, frozen. I felt like the world around me was crumbling. All those nights I had stayed awake, wondering if he was okay, worrying about him, and counting down the days until I could come home to him, and this is what he had been doing? It was as if everything I had been afraid of had suddenly become real. The signs I had tried to ignore, the excuses I had brushed off, were all laid out in front of me, in black and white. There was no denying it now. My husband had been cheating on me. And it wasn't just some fling, this had been going on for almost the entire time I was deployed. I tried to catch my breath, but it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My heart raced as I scrolled further through the messages, desperate to understand the full extent of the betrayal. He knew he was guilty, and there was nothing he could say to change that. "I'm sorry," he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to happen." "Didn't mean for it to happen?" I repeated, my voice rising with anger. "You've been lying to me for almost a year, David. That's not something that just happens. You made a choice. Every single time you met with her, every time you lied to me, you made a choice." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I didn't want to cry in front of him. I didn't want him to see how deeply he had hurt me. "I was lonely," he said, his voice cracking. "You were gone for so long, and I didn't know how to handle it. It just happened." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. His excuses felt like a slap in the face. I had been away, yes, but not because I wanted to be. I had been serving my country, protecting our future, while he had been betraying me behind my back. "And what about me?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger. "Do you think it was easy for me? Do you think I didn't feel lonely? But I didn't cheat. I didn't turn to someone else." David sat in silence, his head hanging low. He didn't have an answer, because there was no excuse for what he had done. "I gave everything to this marriage," I continued, my voice breaking. "I sacrificed so much for us, for you. And this is how you repay me?" Tears finally spilled down my cheeks, and I wiped them away angrily. I had told myself I wouldn't cry, but the pain was too much to bear. The man I had loved and trusted for 15 years had shattered my heart, and there was no going back. "I don't know what to say," David whispered. "I'm sorry. I really am. Sorry." That word felt so empty, so meaningless. What was sorry going to do? It wasn't going to fix the broken pieces of our marriage. It wasn't going to erase the betrayal or the lies. "I don't want your apology," I said quietly. "I want the truth. How long have you been seeing her?" David hesitated for a moment before answering. "Almost a year." "And you've been intimate with her?" He nodded, shame evident on his face. "Yes." My heart sank. I had known the truth, but hearing it from him made it all the more real. There was no going back now. Our marriage, our life together, was built on lies. I stood up, unable to stay in the room any longer. "I need some time to think." Without waiting for his response, I walked out of the living room, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. The confrontation had been brutal, but it had given me the clarity I needed. Now, I had to decide what to do next. The hours after our confrontation felt like a blur. I paced around the house, the echo of David's words still ringing in my ears. Almost a year. A whole year of lies, of betrayal, of him living a double life behind my back. It was hard to wrap my mind around it. How could someone I loved, someone I had built a life with, be capable of such deceit? I didn't know what to do next. I wasn't the type to give up on anything easily, especially not a marriage I had fought so hard to keep alive. But how could I possibly forgive him? Could I even imagine a future with him after knowing what he had done? My mind swung between rage and sadness, and I felt trapped in a whirlwind of emotions that I couldn't control. I spent the rest of the day avoiding David. I needed space, as physical, mental, emotional space, just to think. I took a walk through our neighborhood, trying to clear my head, but the fresh air didn't do much to help. I couldn't escape the storm of thoughts, the memories of our life together flashing before me like scenes from a movie. The good times, the laughter, the holidays we spent together, they all felt tainted now. How could I ever look at those memories the same way? As I walked, I kept asking myself, what now? What was the right thing to do? Part of me wanted to pack my bags and leave right then and there, but another part of me, the part that had always believed in commitment and loyalty, hesitated. 15 years. That was a long time. Could I really throw it all away? When I got home, David was sitting on the couch, staring at the floor. He looked up when I walked in, his face etched with regret and sorrow. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then the reality of his betrayal hit me again like a wave, and the sympathy vanished. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice soft and broken. "I wish I could take it all back." I didn't respond. What was there to say? His apology didn't change anything. It didn't erase the months of lies or the pain I was feeling. It didn't fix the fact that he had chosen someone else over me. "I know I've hurt you," David continued, his eyes pleading with me for forgiveness. "I don't deserve it, but I want to try to fix this. I don't want to lose you." I stood there, staring at him, wondering how he could say those words. How could he sit there and ask me to forgive him after everything he had done? How could he expect me to just move on, to pretend like this affair was some sort of bump in the road that we could overcome? "I need time," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this. I don't know if we can ever be the same." David nodded, his face crumbling with guilt. "I understand. Take all the time you need." For the next few days, I barely spoke to David. We lived in the same house, but it felt like we were strangers sharing the same space. He gave me the distance I needed, and I took that time to think. To really think. I went over every detail of our relationship, trying to figure out where things had gone wrong. Had this been my fault? Had I been too focused on my career, too distant while I was away on deployment? But no matter how much I tried to find a reason, the truth was simple: this was David's choice. He had chosen to betray me. I sought advice from close friends and family. They were shocked, of course, but supportive. Some told me to leave him immediately, while others suggested counseling, telling me that every marriage goes through tough times and that forgiveness, while hard, was possible. But forgiveness didn't come easy for me. Not when the betrayal cut this deep. Every time I looked at David, I saw the lies. I saw the nights he had spent with her. I saw the trust that had been shattered. One evening, after a particularly long day of reflecting and soul-searching, I sat down and made a list. A literal, physical list of reasons to stay and reasons to leave. I had heard people say this was a good way to help make difficult decisions, and I was willing to try anything at this point. On one side of the paper, I wrote down all the reasons to stay: the years we had spent together, the life we had built, the fact that despite everything, part of me still loved him. But as I looked at that list, I realized something: it wasn't enough. Love, history, shared memories, they couldn't erase what had been done. They couldn't rebuild the trust that had been shattered. On the other side of the paper, I wrote down the reasons to leave: the lies, the betrayal, the affair. And that list? It was short, but it was heavy. It outweighed everything else. I couldn't ignore it any longer. That night, I knew. I knew that staying with David wasn't an option. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about the broken trust, the broken foundation of our marriage. I could forgive him eventually, maybe, but I would never be able to forget. And without trust, what kind of marriage did we have? The next morning, I sat David down at the kitchen table. His eyes were filled with hope, as if he thought we could somehow move past this. But I knew better. This wasn't something we could get over. "I've made a decision," I said, my voice steady but calm. "I'm leaving." David's face fell, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince me to stay. Maybe, deep down, he knew this was the only way forward too. "I'm sorry," he whispered again, his voice breaking. I nodded. "I know. But this is something I can't forgive." And with that, it was over. The marriage I had fought so hard for, the life I had built with David, was over. I walked out of the kitchen, my heart heavy but my mind clear. I didn't know what the future held for me, but I knew one thing: I deserved better than this. The day I walked out of our home for the last time, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was a heavy sadness, of course. How could there not be? I had just ended a marriage that had lasted 15 years, a marriage filled with memories, with moments of joy, laughter, and companionship. But there was also a sense of relief. I hadn't realized how much the weight of David's betrayal had been crushing me until I made the decision to walk away. It was as if I could finally breathe again. In the days and weeks that followed, I went through a roller coaster of feelings. There were times when I felt empowered by my decision to leave, proud of myself for standing up for my self-worth and not settling for less than I deserved. But then there were moments when the grief hit me out of nowhere. I would be folding laundry or making a cup of coffee, and suddenly, a memory of David and I together would surface, bringing with it a wave of sadness that I hadn't anticipated. I had to remind myself over and over again that healing wasn't a linear process, it was a journey, one that would take time. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine. It was my space, my sanctuary, where I could focus on rebuilding my life. The first few nights were the hardest. The silence was overwhelming. I wasn't used to being alone, and the quietness of the apartment only amplified the loneliness I felt. I missed the routine of being with someone, even if that someone had betrayed me. But I reminded myself that this loneliness was temporary. It was a step I needed to take to rediscover who I was outside of my marriage. For so long, my identity had been wrapped up in being David's wife and in my role as a general in the military. But now, I had to figure out who I was without those titles. I threw myself into work at first, taking on extra responsibilities to keep my mind occupied. My colleagues at the base were supportive, although they didn't know the full details of what had happened. They just knew that I had gone through a rough time, and they gave me the space I needed to adjust. As the weeks turned into months, I realized that work alone couldn't heal me. I had to confront the emotional wounds that David's betrayal had left behind. I started going to therapy, something I had never done before. At first, I was skeptical. I didn't want to sit in a room with a stranger and pour out my heart. But as I began to talk through everything, the hurt, the anger, the feelings of inadequacy, I started to understand myself in ways I hadn't before. Therapy helped me process the betrayal, but more importantly, it helped me rediscover my own worth. I began to focus on taking care of myself, both physically and mentally. I started running again, something I hadn't done since before my last deployment. The early morning runs through the neighborhood became a form of meditation for me. With every step, I felt myself getting stronger, not just physically but emotionally as well. Running gave me the time and space to think, to process, and to heal. It was a reminder that I was capable of overcoming hard things. I also reconnected with friends I had lost touch with during my marriage. For so long, I had been wrapped up in my relationship with David that I hadn't made much time for anyone else. But now, I was rediscovering the importance of friendship. My friends became my lifeline, pulling me out of the darkness when I felt like sinking back into it. They reminded me of the person I was before David, the person I still was underneath all the pain. As time passed, the wounds of the betrayal began to heal, little by little. I learned to stop blaming myself for what had happened. For months, I had replayed every moment of our marriage, wondering if I had done something wrong, if there had been signs I had missed. But through therapy and reflection, I realized that David's choices were his own. I hadn't caused his affair, and I couldn't have prevented it. All I could do now was focus on my own healing and growth. I started to pursue hobbies and interests that I had neglected during my marriage. I enrolled in a photography class, something I had always wanted to do but never had the time for. I began volunteering at a local shelter, giving back to my community in ways that filled my heart with purpose. Slowly, I was building a life that was mine, a life that didn't revolve around anyone else's expectations or betrayals. It wasn't easy. There were still days when I missed the companionship, when I longed for the life I had once had with David. But those moments became fewer and farther between as I focused on building a new life for myself. I had spent so much time fighting for my country and for my marriage that I had forgotten to fight for myself. Now, that was my priority. About a year after the divorce, something unexpected happened. I was at a friend's gathering when I met someone who didn't know anything about my past, about the betrayal, or the hurt I had been through. His name was Michael. He was kind, funny, and easy to talk to. At first, I was hesitant. I wasn't sure if I was ready to let someone new into my life. I didn't want to be hurt again. But as we spent more time together, I realized that Michael wasn't David. He was someone different, someone who respected me, who valued me for who I was. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It wasn't a grand love story like you see in the movies. But it was something real, something gentle, something that allowed me to heal even more. For the first time in a long time, I started to feel like I could open my heart again. I had learned so much from my experience with David, the importance of trust, the value of self-respect, and the power of healing. I had walked through the fire, and I had come out the other side, stronger and more certain of who I was. My journey wasn't over, but I knew that I was on the right path. Healing wasn't easy, but it was possible. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. As the months rolled by, I found myself in a place I hadn't expected, contentment. It wasn't a word I had associated with myself for a long time. Not when I was navigating the storm of David's betrayal or the grief of ending a 15-year marriage. But now, standing in my little apartment, looking out at the world with fresh eyes, I realized that I had built a new life, one that I was proud of. The past year had been one of the hardest of my life, but also one of the most transformative. I had learned so much about myself, about my strength, my resilience, and my capacity to heal. I had started this journey feeling broken, as if the betrayal had taken away something essential from me. But now, I understood that it hadn't broken me at all. In fact, it had helped me discover parts of myself that I didn't even know existed. David and I had finalized the divorce a few months back. It wasn't a drawn-out process, thankfully. We both knew that there was no salvaging what was left of our marriage, and we both wanted to move on. He tried a few times to reach out, to apologize again, to ask if we could remain friends. But I knew that wasn't possible for me. I needed a clean break, a fresh start without the shadows of the past lingering over me. So, I gently but firmly declined, wishing him well and moving forward with my life. I had also realized something important during this time: forgiveness. Not for David, at least, not in the way he might have wanted. But for myself. I had been carrying around so much guilt, so much self-blame for not seeing the signs sooner, for not being able to save our marriage. But over time, through therapy and self-reflection, I learned to forgive myself for those things. I couldn't control David's actions, and his betrayal wasn't a reflection of my worth. That was a powerful lesson, one that freed me in ways I hadn't expected. There were moments, of course, when I still thought about him. How could I not? 15 years of marriage doesn't just disappear overnight. But the memories of our time together no longer held the same pain they once did. They were simply that, memories. A part of my past that I had come to terms with. During this time of healing, my relationship with Michael also grew. We didn't rush into anything serious, and that was exactly what I needed. Michael understood that I was still healing, still learning to trust again, and he never pressured me. Instead, we spent time together, getting to know each other slowly. It was the kind of companionship that I hadn't realized I was missing: easy, kind, and without any expectations. But it wasn't just about Michael. The biggest transformation had happened within me. I was learning to enjoy my own company, to be comfortable with who I was without the need for anyone else to validate me. I had rediscovered hobbies that I loved: photography, running, and even painting, which was something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. My life was full again, not because of any one person, but because I had filled it with things that brought me joy and peace. One evening, as I sat in my apartment looking through some old photographs, I came across a picture of myself and David from our wedding day. I stared at it for a long time, remembering the hope and love that had once filled that moment. We had been so young, so full of dreams for the future. But life had taken us down a different path, one I never could have predicted. And yet, I didn't feel sadness as I looked at that picture. Instead, I felt gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons I had learned, for the strength I had discovered within myself, and for the new future that was unfolding before me. Life had a way of surprising you like that. What I had once thought would break me had instead led me to a place of peace and fulfillment. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending that the pain hadn't happened. It was about accepting it, embracing the lessons it had brought, and moving forward with an open heart. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. I wasn't afraid of being alone, of facing challenges, or of opening myself up to love again. David had been a chapter in my life, an important one, but a chapter that had come to an end. And now, I was writing a new one. This time, I was the author of my own story. No more waiting for someone else to define my happiness, no more relying on a relationship to fill the gaps in my heart. I had learned that my happiness, my peace, came from within. As I sat there, looking at the photograph, I smiled. Not because everything had turned out the way I had planned, but because everything had turned out exactly the way it was meant to. I had found myself again, stronger, wiser, and more at peace than I had ever been before. I put the photograph back in the box and stood up, feeling a sense of closure wash over me. The past was the past, and I had made my peace with it. Now, it was time to embrace the future, whatever it held. With that thought, I opened the door to my apartment and stepped outside, ready to face whatever came next with an open heart and a strong spirit. Finding faith after betrayal, how God heals a broken heart. Melissa's story is a powerful example of the pain and heartache caused by betrayal. After years of serving her country and trusting her husband, she returned home to a devastating discovery, an affair that shattered her world. Yet, through her journey of healing, we can find biblical lessons that offer guidance on forgiveness, self-worth, and moving forward with faith. The Bible has much to say about betrayal, offering wisdom and comfort for those who, like Melissa, face the emotional and spiritual toll it brings. Melissa's journey of pain, decision, and healing mirrors many teachings found in Scripture. One of the most well-known betrayals in the Bible is the story of Joseph. Joseph was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, and suffered for years because of their jealousy and cruelty. Yet, through it all, Joseph remained faithful to God, even when he couldn't understand why such betrayal had happened. In the end, Joseph was able to say to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Genesis 50 verse 20. In Melissa's case, David's betrayal felt like a crushing blow, one that threatened to destroy her sense of self and her trust in others. But, as Joseph's story teaches us, even the most painful situations can be used by God for a greater purpose. God didn't cause David's betrayal, but he walked alongside Melissa through her pain and began to transform that heartache into something new, a deeper understanding of her own strength and a future filled with hope and healing. Like Joseph, Melissa learned that, with God, even the darkest moments can be redeemed for something good. Another key lesson Melissa's story teaches us is about the importance of forgiveness. In the New Testament, Jesus speaks directly about forgiveness when Peter asks, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times?" Jesus answered, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times." Matthew 18 verses 21 to 22. This doesn't mean that forgiveness is easy, nor does it mean that we must forget the pain caused by betrayal. In Melissa's case, forgiving David wasn't about staying in a broken marriage or overlooking the hurt he had caused. Rather, it was about releasing the anger and bitterness that could have consumed her. Forgiveness, as Jesus teaches, is not about condoning someone's actions, it's about freeing ourselves from the prison of resentment. Melissa realized that holding on to her anger wouldn't change what had happened, it would only hold her back from finding peace and healing. By choosing to forgive, Melissa opened the door to her own emotional and spiritual recovery. Psalm 34 verse 18 reminds us, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." This is a promise that God is near to those who are suffering, especially when betrayal leaves us feeling lost and alone. Melissa experienced this closeness during her journey. In those moments when the pain seemed unbearable, she turned to her faith and found comfort in knowing that God was with her, walking alongside her through the valley of her broken heart. When Melissa moved into her new apartment and began to rebuild her life, she faced the difficult task of rediscovering her self-worth. After years of being David's wife and dedicating herself to her marriage, Melissa had to confront the feelings of inadequacy that betrayal often brings. Many people who are betrayed, like Melissa, wonder if they were not enough or if they somehow caused the betrayal. But the Bible teaches us that our worth doesn't come from how others treat us, it comes from God. In Psalm 139 verse 14, we are reminded, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, I know that full well. Melissa, like all of us, is wonderfully made in the image of God, and her value isn't determined by David's choices. As she began to heal, Melissa came to understand that her worth was not tied to the betrayal but to her identity as a child of God. She learned that she was deserving of love, respect, and happiness, whether or not David had given her those things. Melissa's story also highlights the importance of trusting God's plan, even when the future seems uncertain. After the divorce, Melissa was stepping into the unknown. Her marriage, which had once been the foundation of her life, was gone. But Proverbs 3 verses 5 to 6 tells us, Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight. Though Melissa didn't know what the future held, she chose to trust in God's guidance. Over time, she saw that while her marriage had ended, her life was far from over. God had new plans for her, plans to bring her healing, joy, and new opportunities. Jeremiah 29 verse 11 reminds us of this truth. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Melissa's life didn't go the way she had planned, but by trusting God, she found hope in the future He had prepared for her. Finally, Melissa's story illustrates the biblical truth that there is always hope for a new beginning. In Isaiah 43 verses 18 to 19, God says, Forget the former things, do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up, do you not perceive it? After her divorce, Melissa could have dwelled on the pain and betrayal for the rest of her life, but she chose to move forward. God was doing something new in her life, and Melissa embraced that new beginning. Through therapy, self-care, and reconnection with her passions and friends, she found healing. Her new relationship with Michael, built on trust and mutual respect, was a reflection of the new thing God was doing in her heart and life. Melissa didn't let the past define her. Instead, she embraced the new future God was creating for her. In conclusion, Melissa's story offers us valuable lessons from the Bible. Her journey reminds us to forgive, to trust God's plan, and to recognize our worth in His eyes. It also teaches us that, even after betrayal, God can bring new beginnings and hope. Betrayal doesn't have to be the end of the story. With faith, healing, and God's guidance, it can be the beginning of something beautiful.